everybody have their handout for cross-examination in front of them? Yes, cool. We're all set to go. Okay, so cross-examination is a 3-minute period after each constructive for the opponent of the competitor to ask questions. Now, this period of time is actually very important, even though it's only 3 minutes. You may think that just a 3-minute question and answer period is not that important, but as my dad likes to say, it is the defining factor in the round. If you are a good cross-examiner, or if you answer questions well, a lot of time that leaves an impression in the judge's mind that you're the better debater. And a lot of the time, this is the period of time where judges make a judgment on you, and if they think that you're going to win the round or not. So this is actually very, very important. Now, the goal of cross-examination is to set up for future arguments. Now, Josh was talking about this a little bit when he talked about his responses. He talked about maybe making a reference to your argument within cross-examination. Now, I did this a lot last year. I actually thought of stock questions to ask my opponent during the round. Now, you don't have that on your flow, but maybe you can write that in the margins. I thought of questions that I wanted my opponent to admit to. For example, for the first resolution last year about liberal arts and practical skills, my negative in support of practical skills, the very foundation of the case, was that practical skills and liberal arts have developed and changed throughout the years. So I would ask my opponent in cross-examination if they believed that was true. And most of the time they said yes, but they agreed to the fundamental foundation of my case before they even heard it. And a lot of times I could pull that over their head throughout the rebuttals. I would say, judges, I'd like to bring you back to that cross-examination, and I'd like to remind you that my opponent actually agrees to the foundation of my case. So cross-examination can be very useful when sort of bringing up arguments and reminding the judge or maybe preempting an argument as well. Another goal of cross-examination is to expound upon your position. Now, say that your opponent is asking you questions after you've just given your constructive speech. Sometimes the opponent will ask you a question saying, could you explain this point in your speech? What does this actually mean? So you can really use this time, because it's only 3 minutes, to sort of expound upon your point and reiterate your case, just reaffirming what you already said, which can be very important, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. Another goal of cross-examination is to damage your opponent's credibility. Now, sometimes you can ask your opponent a question that they don't know how to answer. And sometimes they'll try and make up answers on the fly, and they may get a little bit flustered. And if you keep on pressing that question, it'll damage their credibility. The judge will see that they really don't know how to answer that question, and they're just trying to make up answers, and that'll impact the judge's view of your opponent. So this can be very tactical for cross-examination, even though it's 3 minutes. The last goal of cross-examination is to possibly create doubts in the judge's mind. Now, Josh talked about this a little bit, I believe, yesterday, but if you keep on asking questions that say your opponent doesn't really know how to respond to, that'll get your judge thinking. And then after cross-examination, you're going to sit down and go to prep time, and that'll be a period of silence, and your judge is going to be thinking about how the round has gone so far. So if you ask questions that your opponent doesn't really know how to answer, or things that maybe your judge can consider, they'll start thinking about that, and then they can start to side with your argument before you've even spoken. So those are the goals of cross-examination and what cross-examination is. Now, there are different types of questions that you can ask in cross-examination. Now, the first type is called a closed-ended question. Now, closed-ended questions are questions that must have a yes or no answer. So an example of this would be, would you agree that liberal arts and practical skills have changed from what they used to be in the past? This question does not allow your opponent to give this huge, long answer to that question. It demands a yes or no answer. So you can state your question and then state the phrase yes or no after you ask that question, and that forces them to have a yes or no answer. These can be very important and tactical because you only have 3 minutes of cross-examination. These questions are very powerful, and they don't allow your opponent to just explain and take all of your time. Closed-ended questions are the strongest of the two types of questions because they are closed-ended, because they don't allow your opponent to sort of expound and dodge the answer. They are the strongest. Now, the second type and the last type of question you can ask in cross-examination is a clarifying or open-ended question. Now, clarifying questions are questions that are open-ended and allow the examinee to expound upon their answer. So an open-ended question would maybe be, could you explain your subpoint A under your first contention? That's an open-ended question. That allows your opponent to just talk and talk about that first subpoint A. Also, an example of a clarifying question is if you ask them to redefine something or say, what was your value again? That's not a closed-ended question because that allows them to give an answer. Now, clarifying questions can be nice because if you miss a tag or something like that, you can ask that, but they are weaker because that allows for your opponent to just keep on talking and so on and so forth. So only use clarifying questions if you do not understand a concept or miss the tag of an argument. Because cross-examination is very pivotal in the judge's mind and it can be a very, very strong persuasion, you don't want to use closed-ended questions too often because they are weaker. You only want to use them if you misunderstand something or if you missed a tag on an argument and you really need those. And again, like I said, clarifying questions are the weakest of the two. So I've talked about the different types of questions and the goals of cross-examination and what is cross-examination. Does anybody have any questions so far? Well, to the next section. Cool. Okay, so this is asking questions. And when you're the cross-examiner, you always want to ask the judge or opponent if they are ready before starting cross-examination. So how cross-examination goes is your opponent just finished talking about their constructive speech, so they're already standing up and at the podium, and you'll get up from the prep table and you'll come stand next to them. Now, you don't want to start firing away questions before the judge and the opponent are ready. That can oftentimes leave a bad taste in the judge's mouth if they're just not ready for you or your opponent. You want to be very courteous and ask them before. I know this seems really simple, but sometimes the reminder is needed. Second, you want to start with an introductory statement, but do not ask, how are you doing? How are you doing in STOA debate can sometimes be a little cliche. A lot of people ask when they start cross-examination, how are you doing today? And then their opponent says, I'm doing well, how are you doing? And it seems very pointless, it's very shallow, and it's just something that people say and there's really no meaning to it. But that doesn't mean you want to just jump straight into questions. A lot of times what I'll say is, that was a really nice speech. I just have a few questions for you. And so that's still an introductory statement, but it's not the cliche, how are you, what are you doing? And because it's the very first thing in cross-examination, you want it to be strong, but you also want it to be respectful. So asking how are you doing is not necessarily a strong question. So after your introductory statement, start off with a strong, closed-ended question. In cross-examination, you want to start off very strong. That'll give the judge the appearance that you know what you're talking about and you know and you're ready to respond to your opponent. It gives the appearance that you are in control of the round if you start off with that strong, closed-ended question. Now you want to ask your clarifying questions at the end of the round, conversely to asking your closed-ended questions at the beginning. So towards the very end of cross-examination, if you have any clarifying questions, just say, oh, and what was the tag for your first contention? And it's just a very simple, easy way to get that information, but it's not consuming your cross-examination time, and it doesn't really allow your opponent to just expound upon it as well. So allow your opponent to answer your questions and never cut him or her off. You want to be very respectful and very courteous of your opponent. Don't ask questions and then cut them off before they've finished answering the question. They may be trying to take a roundabout way of answering that question, but you still want to give them time to answer the question. You want to use those answers for your benefits. You still want the answer to the question. And be respectful. If your opponent keeps rambling on and on, you can take a step forward. You can put your hand out to let them know that they've answered the question, you get it. Or you can you can say, or something like that, but don't just cut them off because that can be considered rude and the judge will see that. And finally, you always want to be respectful. I think this is a given, but in cross-examination, it's really easy to have an attitude and get a little feisty because your opponent's not going to want to answer your questions and they don't want to give you any ground. They know that. So they're going to try and dodge all of your questions from the get-go, but you really just have to hold it together. And if they're not answering a question, that's okay. You can ask that question a couple of times, and if they seem really stubborn about it, move on. The judge will see that, they'll notice that you're being respectful, and they'll also notice how your opponent didn't answer the question. So because of that, you just want to be very respectful, try not to get heated in cross-examination, and it's very easy to do that. So answering the questions. When you're answering questions, you always want to tell the truth. You never want to escape from the truth. You never want to twist the truth. Always be truthful when you're answering those questions, because your opponent can come back up later and say, wait, in his constructive, he said something completely different than he said in cross-examination, and he can bring that up and he can say you're contradicting yourself, or you may just confuse the round, and a lot of the time the judge can see right through when you're trying to twist the truth and trying to twist the answer to a question. You want to take every opportunity to expound upon your case and position. A lot of in STOA don't ask close-ended questions, I found. They ask a lot of clarifying questions. And you can take this opportunity to just explain your case and explain your position. Now, you don't want to walk all over your opponent and just keep talking and rambling and talking, but you can take every opportunity to just really solidify what you just said, and that'll make the judge believe that you have a really strong case and a really strong argument. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know. Now, if you don't know the answer to a question, don't try and make up an answer, because odds are that your opponent will keep pressing you, and then you're gonna just start floundering and you won't know how to answer the question. It's a lot stronger to say, I don't know the answer to that question, and then they move on, than trying to think of a response or trying to think of an answer to a question. It's okay to say, I don't know. And finally, you want to be respectful of your opponent's time. Now, even though you are trying to grasp every opportunity to share your position and your case, you do want to be respectful of your opponent's time. Your opponent and your judge will notice if you're just rambling and rambling and rambling, and your judge, more often than not, will think that that's rude, which is something that you do not want to happen in cross-examination. So that's all I have for cross-ex. Does anybody have any questions? No? Okay, cool.
Will the judge think that you don't know what you're talking about if you say I don't know?
It's better to say I don't know and to admit it than trying to create an answer, because you'll get the same thing. So if you just try and create an answer off the top of the head, and a lot of times you'll just keep rambling on and not knowing what you're saying, they can still tell that you don't know, and they can tell it's not a direct answer.
Okay.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I was just going to say that if you're new at it and you can't really think of things, how would you advise these kids, like if they hear one and they're like, oh, is there some just standard go-to close-ended questions that?
Well, what I did last year is I had a series of questions that I always asked for my case, some things that I wanted my opponent to admit to. So before the round, they can take as much time as they want, prepping for the tournament, to think of questions that they're going to ask. And really, cross-ex just comes with practice. I only took like a minute and a half of my cross-examination time, my first debate round, and I only asked clarifying questions. So it really just comes with practice. The more you do it, the better you get at it. But I thought of a lot of questions.
I love that idea. You had said that one that you had thought of, but I didn't think about that you had a whole list. Yeah. That's a great idea.
And a lot of times people actually do a cross-ex web. So they'll have a question, and then they'll have, say your opponent says yes or no, and then they'll have a follow-up question, and then yes or no, which always leads back down to the ultimate conclusion that you want them to give. So you can create those if you want, but a lot of times when I'm asking questions, they'll say something and that'll spark another question. So sometimes it just goes with the flow.
Thank you.
Well, I've been judging LD, and so to answer the question about how is the judge going to think when you say I don't know, I respect that instead of the rambling on, which I've seen both sides.
Yeah.
And it didn't affect my decision. The one time I heard it, I just was like, okay, good, because then you're not just listening to things being made up or things that don't sound right, and then you just totally nuked your opportunity to maybe win.
Right.
But when you say I don't know, it's just, okay, now I'll write down next, this is something to study up on, because someone else might ask you, and it didn't determine whether they won or lost either in that particular round.
Yeah.
It's the whole thing in a nutshell when you make a decision. So.
Right. Exactly.
So a judge's perspective on I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you. Any more questions about cross-ex? And for cross-examination, always act like you have it under control, and always act like you know what you're talking about, even if you don't. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know, like she said, but say that with confidence, like, I don't know, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question. So just say things with confidence, say things like you're in control of the round, smile in cross-ex especially if you're starting off have a big smile, nod your head, be like, yeah, I totally understand that. I have another question for you. Just be very polite and very pleasant, but just be strong and in control for classics. Do you have a question, Anna?
It's not really about cross-ex, but I remember, I don't know when this was, but I was timing, and I don't know if it was LD or TP, but when I walked into the room, they said that there was, like, some stuff that I couldn't listen to, and they said that I had to go out of the room, and I was just wondering if you've ever encountered that.
I have never encountered that. The only reason why they would do that is if the topic of debate was inappropriate for a young audience,
Begs
which I don't
the
know.
question, why are they doing it
Right.
in STOA?
Right, exactly. I don't really know of a case that would necessarily have that. This year, I don't think there would be a case that would necessarily have that. So, that's the only thing. I'm sorry. Anything else?